very, very tight schedule and, you know, a very profound panel, a very profound audience. Thanks for being up that early, 9 o'clock in New York. We had a pre-lecture evening, pre-discussion with many open topics yesterday evening. And just moving a bit back from the box. And of course, we saw that there's many points of discussion, of course, discussing Vienna 1900. We were talking about diversity, and here we are, 4 men starting at the podium. But I can assure you we will get a 50-50 equation. There's 2 Americans, 2 Austrian, and there is musicology. I'm getting a bit. There's musicology and there is literary scholarship. So 50-50 equation. So I hope that we make up for our male bias. I'm very proud to have you here. It's a great honor and privilege to discuss. Before I introduce the podium to you, I want to mention why we are doing this. When Professor Radkolb and I met, I said, after having read Julian Barnes' The Man with the Red Coat, we should look a bit more into the roots of the Vienna 1900 discussion. And the exhibition Traum und Wirklichkeit it's almost 40 years gone, and more years have gone by till Shorski's book. And of course, we have to challenge our assumptions, our views on the propositions done in this book. And as Stephen Beller said, are we sure that Vienna is the pinpoint of modernity comparing to Paris or Berlin at the time? And maybe it's the enormous transformation that Viennese society underwent in the late 19th century that made modernity such a changing point in Vienna. And speaking of diversity, yesterday we of course have diversity of thoughts and ideas. But the question between the past and the present is, how is diversity formulated and presented in the public space? Because we have a lot of diversity in Vienna right now, but the discourse is not a discourse of white men, but it's of course a discourse of a predominant in Austria white society. So I'm very glad to bring all that hopefully into the focus of our discussion. We're discussing now the roots of modernity in music with an interesting psychoanalytical and perspective into this. I want to introduce the panel to you, and I hope I don't, if I make any mistake, please correct me at the moment. I'm very proud to have to my right Leon Botstein. He's president and professor of arts at Bard College. You all know him as a music director of American Symphony Orchestra and the Orchestra Now. And of course, you and I encountered you as somebody opening up the floor to a larger audience in the understanding of the complexity of music. And as I said in our pre-preparation, you opened up a complete new view on Puccini to me, and confronting Puccini with modernity and overcome some old assumptions. So we are very glad and honored to have you here. Welcome. I welcome warmly Rubén Gallo. He's a professor at Princeton. He's from the literary scholarship. He comes from cultural history, and he comes from a field that's very interesting to us, from the study of Latin American culture, and of course with other assumptions and often early assumptions and formulations of modernity than we have in our old Austrian culture. And we will hear from you an approach to Freud and Freud's music. And I just want to refer to 2 of your books, Mexican Modernity, Avant-Garde and Cultural Revolution, and Freud's Mexico, Into the Wilds of Psychoanalysis. analysis. So a warm welcome to you. And Christian Glanz, we also met in some pre-preparations. He is director of the University of Performing Arts Vienna Center on Gustav Mahler and Viennese modernity. He participated in a talk, in a panel discussion on modernity and roots of modernity music that is being broadcast next week in Ö1 on Monday, and there's a big article on topos.ORF.at on Sunday about that and about the complexities, starting with Bruckner, and you're extremely interested in the roots of the 1860s, so to say, where the first traces of modernity are formulated. So thank you all for being here. We make a first round of statements and want to enter into discussion, and our temporary focus is the pre-1900 modernity in music, and of course the interplay between modernity and anti-modernity, because if you're talking about modernity, we of course have to have a starting and a counterpoint where modernity hits the floor and is from the beginning always a dialectic process. So I want to start with you, Professor Botstein. What's your? You said we have to focus on not only the prominent figures, but also very often figures that we tend to overlook in our perspective on modernity in music in Vienna.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming. And with Professor Gallo next to me, we can even incorporate Mexican modernism because of Kaiser Max into the Habsburg realm, but we won't go there, right? Because the Chavez went to Paris, not to Vienna to study. So, I think what's interesting about the pre-1900 is, as everybody knows, modernity is a kind of contested category, and I'm not sure how useful it is. So one of the things about modernity that strikes me is the moment at which there is a perceived conflict between part of the audience for the arts and the people making the art, where there is some level of outrage or lack of understanding, and that the artists take a position of resistance to the economic system by which they're supported. They suddenly don't like the audience, and they think the audience is Philistine. They whistle Schubert, but have no idea why that would be great music, and that there is a tension between being popular or winning the audience's approval. So, and then a post-Wagnerian desire to be original, somehow to make a mark. And so the first thing that interests me about all of this is, I think, what are the impulses that allow us later to look at what they're doing as modern? So, as many of you in the audience know, someone like Richard Strauss was seen as a modern composer in the late 80s and the 90s, in the vanguard. And he captured the audience in part and also baffled them, became the object of virulent criticism. And journalism plays a huge role, because journalism is viewed as the enemy. Journalism dumbs down art for the reader, who is a Philistine and can't even distinguish between, let's say, good and not good, in other words, interesting popular entertainment and non-popular entertainment. So, as opposed to looking for modernity in the substance of the pieces themselves. So, I I jotted just 4 basic impulses to what would be modern about music and design before 1900. The first is a reimagination of history. So modernism takes part of its impulse from something like the Festzug at the end by Mahler and the huge painting that was toured all over Europe, the Karl V entering Antwerp, the gigantic canvas now in Hamburg. And this kind of magical, distorted historical painting was a kind of impulse, and you find that impulse in music that's written around that time. It involves Strauss, for example, and Mahler, both of whom are obsessively interested in their predecessors. In Bruckner, in Wagner, in Mozart, in Strauss's case, and Beethoven, Berlioz, and so forth. So one is the reimagination of history, and you see it in the work in music by Zemlinsky, in music with Aperture Brahms. I'm now rehearsing, for example, the Second Symphony of George Enescu, who studied in Vienna and was referred to Helmsberg and Robert Fuchs. And the music is unbelievably interesting and imaginative harmonically. It's within a traditional framework, but it's really out there. It's extremely adventuresome, and more so than some of the early scores of Schoenberg. So one is the reimagining of history, so reinventing history for themselves in not a historicist way, without avoiding historicism. And you see that in Otto Wagner as well. So I see Otto Wagner kind of parallel to Mahler. The second is a decorative impulse. So this decorative impulse has to do with the destruction of nature and the growing urban environment, in my view, that all that decorative detail that Klimt, for example, take the Beethoven exhibition with the Klinger statue in the middle. This is about decoration, or even when Dumba, for example, he asked Mahler to make his music room. Right? Well, then they follow up with this complete design, Gesamtkunstwerk idea of design and jewelry and the decorative impulse, which is in architecture as well, and Otto Wagner has it as well. So there's a decorative aspect, and the decorative aspect also has some connection to humor. There's something about humor and irony, which is also playing tricks on the audience. Again, you see that in Mahler all the time, but not only him. And then there's the question of anonymity and identity, not in our sense, but what I find very interesting is that the relation of the artist to membership in various communities, national communities. So the nationalities conflict in the empire, that is constant concern. You see it in Schnitzler's novel, the rise of Zionism, and the questions have to do with anti-Semitism. Who am I? And the fear of anonymity. There is an enormous recognition suddenly, and partly bolstered by also a kind of grander theory of science in which we are all variables without individuality. There's a concern for the possible erasure of oneself or insignificance. And again, with the newspapers, there's suddenly a premium on fame. Now, I'm always impressed, it doesn't have to be Vienna, but you know that the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre, and more people came to visit the empty spot where the Mona Lisa hung than ever watch the painting. The painting is world famous because it was stolen and no one could see it. So that tells you something about this mass phenomenon that is journalism. And the last thing, which perhaps interests me most, is especially with the spread of literacy. This is true of music literacy and ordinary literacy. We speak about literacy as if it's a single phenomenon. It's not. The ability to read a newspaper, we know this now in American politics in particular. Being literate is no direct train line to understanding. In fact, it's a train line for an immense amount of manipulation and the worst kind of, let's say, propaganda, which has no connection to the truth. So in modernism, the most interesting impulse, and you see it in not only famous people like Berg or people like Schoenberg later, who think that they're in the truth business. They're making art for truth. They're telling the truth in a way that maybe language can't tell. And their pupils, or people they inspire, are the less well-known later on in the 20s, people like Hugo Kauder or the minor struggling figures that come to Vienna in the 20s. So the idea is that there's an ethical impulse to the making of art. That's not decorative, and that's not commercial in some way. There's a little hypocrisy in that, but not commercial. And therefore, the fragmentation that you hear in Mahler, or the shocking turns or sonorities that composers deal in, and the miniaturization of musical experience, from the large Brucknerian to the very dense, short work that ultimately become part of the modern vocabulary. That's about some idea that the aesthetic medium in the modern world has a unique opportunity for truth-telling. And that's Karl Kraus, of course, is the hero of these artists. But I think that when we look back in a new way, I would argue the one person who emerges as being unbelievably modern and garishly so, with a lot of what I would say courage, is actually one of the most derided figures, and that's Machart himself. When you look carefully at that 1878 painting, it is fantastic. That magical realism in it it's spectacular and garish in ways which have a rebellious quality to it. That he was Wagner's favorite painter, I won't hold against him.
We opened up already as we were talking in how we are organizing the panel. We quickly came to the conclusion that we have to deal with different concepts of modernity and not only derive it from the aesthetic field. And I think you opened up the perspective to that. And speaking the truth is, of course, the big moment of literature and stream of consciousness since symbolism or D'Annunzio maybe. But in our scholarship, we go back to where the realism becomes modern and where the modernity is hidden in literature. So I want to ask Rubén, Gallo, you are also working on a very interdisciplinary field, and you said you will present us something surprising to Freud and to the aspect of his pronounced tone deafness. So how's the interplay between bringing up the truth and posing against various assumptions with Freud?
Okay, thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Oliver Radko and the organizers for convening this symposium, which is very rich and There are many ideas that were presented last night and also this morning. I think Leon Botstein's ideas set the tone for many of the topics that we can discuss in the following hours. And I'm especially attentive to two ideas that you presented. One is the idea of the 1890s, as basically the moment where we have all of these tensions. On the one hand, you have the avant-garde, you have these figures, not only in music, but in painting, in literature, in almost every discipline, including psychoanalysis, pushing forward, in a true avant-garde gesture, breaking with tradition, breaking with the established norms for making art or music or psychology, and innovating. On the other hand, as you said, there are many tensions, many contradictions, not only between an audience, that might not always be receptive to these experiments, and we all know, one example, the interpretation of dreams, sold about 300 copies, in the first year that it was published. It has sold countless millions since then. So I think that's an example of the audience that is not yet ready to receive the message that is produced by the avant-garde. And that is the very definition of the avant-garde, the military metaphor in which the artists are at the forefront and seeing things, that maybe the rest of society cannot yet see, but will see in due time. I was also thinking, related to this idea of tension in the 1890s, to an idea that Helga presented last night, which is very close to me. And this is the relationship between culture and politics, which I think we live in a moment, where this is at the forefront of the discussions. And what's interesting is that in the 1890s in Vienna, we already see, this clash between culture and politics. We have all these progressive artists and thinkers, and the figure of Karl Lueger was evoked last night. This very reactionary mayor of Vienna, famously anti-Semitic, who was the opposite of what the avant-garde was trying to do, and very much clashed with many of the figures, including Freud. So I think that tension between culture, arts, and politics was very much at the forefront of what Vienna was in the 1890s, especially. So I thought, just for fun, I like examples, I think examples can just help our discussion. So I thought I would bring to the table one example that to me is very interesting of how someone in the 1890s dealt with this tension between culture and politics. And this is taken from someone who has been very important for my intellectual development. I've written about him, and that's Sigmund Freud. And in the interpretation of dreams, there's one dream which is about opera, it's about music, and it's about politics and the way all of these fit together. It's about social injustice, it's about political tensions, it's about what art can do, and especially what music can do in the face of social injustice. It's a very famous dream. Many people have written about it. Karl Schorsky has written about it. Peter Gay has written about it. I think we could put together a little book, which would be very fun, of all the readings of this short dream, which is sometimes called the revolutionary dream, and sometimes the Graf Thun dream. So I'd just like to read you a short excerpt and then give you maybe 3 ideas of how we can think about it for this discussion about Vienna 1900. So here it is, a fragment of what Freud has to say about this dream, which he dreamt sometime in the 1890s. We don't know for sure, but sometime, very late 1890s. So Freud writes, I had driven to the Westbahnhof in Vienna to take the train for my summer holiday at Aussee. There, I had seen Graf Thun, who was traveling to Ischl for an audience with the emperor. And Graf Thun was an aristocrat, a count. He was a minister in the government of the emperor, and someone who represented the kind of aristocratic privilege that for Freud, was really a thorn on his side. Graf Thun walked straight in. The ticket inspector at the gate did not recognize him and tried to take his ticket. But the count waved the man aside with a curt motion and without giving explanation, just kept walking. And Freud becomes incensed. He writes, I had intended to make a long protest to claim equal rights. But instead, I began to hum a tune to myself which I recognize as Figaro's aria from Mozart's Le nozze di Figaro. Se vuol ballare, signor Contino, se vuol ballare, signor Contino, il chitarrino le suonerò. So Freud is humming this, in the middle of the Vespanto, and he notes, in parentheses, it is a little doubtful whether anyone else recognized the tune. Close parentheses. Freud continues, the whole evening I had been in high spirits and in a combative mood. And now all kinds of insolent and revolutionary ideas were going through my head, in keeping with Figaro's words and my recollection of Beaumarchais' comedy. I thought of how our malicious opposition journalists, again, the power of journalism, made jokes about Graf Thun, about his name, calling him instead Graf Nix Thun, Count Do Nothing. Not that I envied him. He was on his way to a difficult audience with the emperor, while I was the real Graf Nix Thun, Count Do Nothing. I was going off on my holidays. End quote. This is a remarkable example, I think, of the clash between culture and politics in the 1890s. It's interesting for many reasons. I'm currently writing about Freud and opera, which is it's a very under-researched area. And Freud always claimed that he didn't really have a musical ear, we can't really imagine Freud going to opera, in the middle of this very society world. But this shows that actually he had quite a sophisticated opera culture. He could just pop up an association. But I wanted to make 3 or 4 comments about this passage. So, first of all, it gives us a picture of Vienna in the 1890s, where there is social mobility. We have to remember that Freud was born to a poor Jewish family in Przybor, what is now the Czech Republic, and it was only through his education and hard work that he rose in society. And by the time he was writing this, he was in his 40s, he had become a middle-class doctor, and he was always very proud of his Bildung, his education, which is what allowed him, to be at that level. Now, what's interesting is that, we tend to think of opera today as somehow elitist. This actually shows you that at the time, such an idea did not exist. Freud never associates opera in these streams, with anything that is beyond his reach or that is, let's say, from the world of Graf Thun. It's quite the opposite. Opera belongs to his world, as basically a self-made middle-class Jewish doctor. And it's actually Graf Thun and his people who cannot recognize the tunes. So there's a very interesting inversion, of the prejudices that one has about opera that happens in this dream. The other thing that really strikes me is to think of, imagine someone who has internalized the culture of music and opera to the point where it appears in dreams as association. There's something so natural and so ingrained in the psyche that it comes out as association. And I was trying to imagine, how many of my Princeton students or students at any college today would have opera come up in dreams or associations. I'm not sure this would happen, but it was very much a reality in 1890s Vienna. Second point, Freud is witnessing a social injustice. You have this privileged aristocrat traveling without a ticket, and the inspector, instead of doing his job and enforcing the rules, is completely passive and just is actually humiliated and doesn't do anything, allows this to happen. Freud is outraged. Now, I was thinking, what would happen today if someone saw this? Someone would be filming it, they would be filming the Graf Thun going in without a ticket, posting it to social media, it would generate all these commentaries. But Freud does something quite different. He actually invokes the world of culture, and specifically music and opera. This association comes through, and he begins to hum a very important aria from Le nozze di Figaro, in which there is a similar situation. You might remember the plot of Le nozze di Figaro. Basically there's this aristocrat, Count Almaviva, who's about to try to exercise his droit du seigneur with Figaro's bride and to try to sleep with her before the wedding. So Figaro is poor. He is a subordinate to the Count. He doesn't have money or power. But what does he have? He has language, wit, and imagination. And this is what the opera is about. And it's quite a revolutionary opera, as Freud was attentive to. In the end, language and wit trump the aristocrat's privilege. And Figaro actually prevails because of the way he uses words and language and the imagination. So Freud invokes this, and he's very attentive to that. And he ends up doing the same. You know, what does he do? He does not confront the Count. He does not make a big protest, even though he thought about it. He actually takes refuge in the world of culture and invokes almost like a secret code that someone who had the same education as him would recognize, but a lot of people do not. And you know, the verses that the lines that he quotes from Figaro said, you know, if you want to dance Little Count, Signor Contino, I will play the tune with my guitar. So it's an inversion of power, which is what we end up seeing in the opera. And it's what Freud imagines, you know, through his fantasy happening in this situation. But, you know, I think what's even more interesting is the way the commentary ends, which is Freud saying, I am the real Count Nixtun. You know, I'm the real Graf Nixtun. So through this work of fantasy, language, the imagination, he actually takes the place of the Count, and he creates an inversion where he is the Count Nixtun because he's going on vacation to do nothing, and the Count is actually having to work. You know, he's a Count Tun that's going to go with the Emperor. So now I think it's quite a radical political gesture, and we can see that Freud was using opera and culture, you know, to create this inversion. And what's interesting is basically culture becomes the antidote to the small injustice that he had seen, you know, basically where someone was exercising this aristocratic privilege. So one last point, you know, if it had stopped there, I mean, I could imagine my students saying, but, you know, there's, you know, you're right, there's something Nixtun in this story, because in the end, he doesn't do anything. You know, Freud just thinks about it, you know, he fantasizes, but there is no actual effect on the world. There is no political effect. But that's not true, because what did Freud do with this fantasy and with these words? He wrote a book. And the book became one of the most important books of the 20th century that actually shaped the way culture and politics and many aspects of the world evolved. So I think, you know, the crucial gesture is not to have, you know, this world of culture, to have this world of the imagination, but also to do something with it, you know, which is writing, which Freud was an example of. So I think this shows us the power of culture as an antidote to political troubles. And in this example, we see how important language, fantasy, and play, which are the raw materials from which arts and culture are made, and how they have the capacity to change the world in small but very significant ways. And again, you know, I was thinking back to Helga's presentation last night and the discussion of the Salzburg Festival. And I think the reason why Salzburg Festival is so important has to do precisely with this gesture. You know, that the idea in a world in which you have tension, social injustices, political trouble, Freud demonstrated, you know, culture can have a real effect in countering that.
Thank you. I mean, this dream is very high literature, I would say, and as we were talking about Hofmannsthal yesterday, one of his first texts he published with 19 years is on D'Annunzio, and he is also this dreamlike perception of reality and the sort of tired youth that is on the one hand alienated from the world, and on the other hand they see themselves as pre-runners who have to do something. Tristan Glanz, the pre-runners, is a topic we've been discussing, and if we were now reflecting upon the seismographic qualities of culture, where are the roots, the pre-runners, even before the 1890s?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the invitation and for organizing this conference. Thank you for your impulses. My first statement will not be on this aspect, but on another aspect. It's again an example, and again music and politics. And I beg for pardon for reading it because there's little time, and I hope to get it in this time. It refers to the years 1897 to 1910, the years of Karl Lueger, already often mentioned as the governing mayor of Vienna. But these years up to 1907 are also the term of Gustav Mahler as the artistic director of Vienna's court opera. And I want to stage Mahler and Lueger as representatives of contrary aspects within fin de siècle Vienna and its narratives. In reference to Mahler, there's the image of a kind of godfather of the contemporaries and the modernists, highlighted, for instance, with his presidency for Schönberg's and Zemlinski's Vereinigung Schaffender Tonkünstler in 1904, his nearness to Vienna's secession, and his backing of Schönberg and others against manifold attacks, also personally backing them. And Schönberg has established this godfather narrative in a very symbolic way, the famous Prague speech from 1912, 1 year after Mahler had passed away, followed then by many authors, including Adorno. This referred both to Mahler as a guiding figure and to his music, which was read as a basis for Schönberg and his Viennese school. In 1913, Paul Stephan, one of the earliest and most committed followers of Mahler, published a small book entitled Das Grab in Wien, The Grave in Vienna, published in Berlin, by the way. Which contained a very polemic chronicle of the years 1903 to 1911. Stephan stages Mahler in the central role as an advocate and protector of Vienna modernism, as the symbolic figure of advancement within the arts, heavily and steadily attacked by vernacular Viennese voices. The central figure of this proclaimed culture of truly Viennese vernacular culture was Karl Lueger, the very successful popular and populistic mayor. He and his Christian Social Party promoted an extensive image of old Vienna, a very professional construction of the place never had existed in reality, but very powerful within politics, within popular arts, and within everyday life. This old Vienna message totally clashed with the very rapid development of the city from an imperial residence towards a modern metropolis. Lueger's Old Vienna, mirrored in many operettas of the day, first and foremost meant the exclusion of the enormous quantity of migrants, most of them migrating to Vienna from within the monarchy's borders. Lueger and his party wanted to keep the power of definition, who would belong to this imagined and vernacular community, and this was handled in a rather flexible, really modernist manner when it came to daily politics, including Lueger's well-known anti-Semitism. In respect to images and pictures, Mahler and Lueger actually appeared as a kind of opposing fighters. Symbolically, as within Paul Stephan's book, and even visibly, as my second slide shows. The symbolic figure of the well-armed strong man is a well-known detail within Gustav Klimt's Beethoven frieze, part of the Secession's exhibition on Beethoven in 1902 already mentioned. Mahler contributed to the opening ceremony of this exhibition with an arrangement of a short section from the final movement of the Ninth Symphony, played by a brass ensemble of the Court Opera's orchestra and conducted by Mahler himself. In the evening of the exhibition's opening, Fidelio was staged in court opera. The heroic male figure, dressed in golden armament, showing a big sword and daring to abstain from wearing his strong ancient Greek-style helmet, seems committed to face the battle openly, the battle for ending the sufferings of weak mankind, symbolized by the three begging and praying figures to his left, in accord with the allegoric figures of pity and ambition framing his head. In 1910, the very year Lueger passed away, Mahler's 50th birthday was celebrated with the Munich publication of a small book again, a small book of friendship and adoration, called Gustav Mahler, A Portrait of His Personality in Form of Dedications, edited again by Paul Stephan. Within this book, Klimt himself revealed the relationship between this figure in the frieze and Mahler. For me, it's not decisive if Klimt had followed this kind of intention already during the conception of his frieze in 1902. At least looking backwards, he did. And the cavalier with sword, armament, and helmet is also part of the very rich pool of Luega's images. Always in the role of protecting Vienna, Vienna usually appearing as young woman, Vindobona. This means true Vienna, which was protected by Luega against all sorts of enemies. In this context, I want to recommend firmly the research on Luega's self-staging done by Elisabeth Heimann, published in 2015. This kind of approach also leads towards Mahler's music. Following the line of symphonies, there is a very clear tendency towards sarcastic and even brutalized appearances of vernacular music, like waltz or like Ländler, culminating in the scherzo movements of the 7th and the 9th Symphony. I think we could read this procedure as a kind of statement and response, as Freud has reacted. Mahler has reacted in this way. The well-armed strong man has fought this way. Thank you.
Is it a book?
Is it possible to respond?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So, yeah. If you don't mind,
You can go into discussion
oh, yes,
now,
so
and
I want to apologize ahead of time. But you know, I'm not used to going to symposiums, and certainly not this early in the morning. But so I have a couple of challenges, if I may. First of all, I'm uncertain about the avant-garde. All these people were remarkably successful. Let's take with Mahler. Mahler was hugely successful. Books being published about him. He was lionized and idealized. Yes, he had enemies. He even had anti-Semitic enemies. The book the Paul Stephan, which one of the major enemies of Mahler was this critic Hirschfeld, who was himself the son of a rabbi and was a very conservative. He wrote a book against Hanslick, you know, when he first made his career, and thought that, like many other people, that Mahler was simply an incompetent composer, or couldn't figure it out. And so it's impossible to be that successful in the public eye, even marry Alma, right, and travel in this high circle to be recruited by the unwashed Americans in 1907 for an exorbitant sum of money in order to become conductor in New York. So he's no failure, he's no outsider, and there is no avant-garde. They have an audience, they buy their work, they support them. This is a full revolutionary art, in my view. So it doesn't exist. It's part of this new world in which art is a kind of public function of the city. I don't consider Luega to be a real conservative. He's an opportunistic politician. He had a very interesting conversation with the music historian Guido Adler, in which he tells Adler, look, you know, don't worry about it. I'm not really serious about this. This is an opportunistic thing. And he pioneers the modernization of the city. And he's the greatest patron of Otto Wagner. I don't think the Salzburg Festival is important. It's in fact an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment to the original idea that Hofmannsthal and Reinhardt had. It had an original idea post-war of creating a new cultural unity in Europe, but it's not, it has nothing to do with it. It's part of a political superstructure. I happen to think Freud wasn't musical. Liking opera doesn't require knowing anything about music. That's why the musical theater survived. You know, so it is. So it, and there's great musical theater. Don't get me wrong, but it's hard to write good musical theater. Trust me. But what is interesting is that music was for his generation among Jews in Vienna and in the Empire the shortest distance between the ghetto and the outside world. So the enrollment in the music academy, for example, then the conservatory in Vienna, was incredibly. Look at the statistics. Almost 40% of the enrollment in the piano classes, violin classes were Jews. And so music had a kind of prestige because it was not linguistic, and it was, you could close your eyes and just have to listen, and it didn't really make a difference. Now, it made a difference if you become appointed at the opera, you had to convert, but basically music is a privilege. So I would think that I don't quite see the dream has had to do anything with, it does have to do with the Beaumarchais play, with the story, definitely, but not with the music.
Although what's interesting about the dream is that he hums the melody. He doesn't say the words.
No, yeah.
I mean, that would be quoting the play, but he's actually humming the melody as a secret code, which only people who know the opera could recognize.
That's true, but remember that, in my view, there are no unmusical people. So one of the great things about the melodies, Mozart's being one, is that they're memorable. And I agree in the sarcasm of the Mahler seventh in particular, with the night music and the parody. But the parody has to do with the hypocrisy, not coming from Luega, not coming from the official government, but the hypocrisy within this new urban cultural audience and its claims to Bildung, its claims to connoisseurship, and being led by critics who then have established themselves as intermediaries. But I just wanted to get my dig into the Salzburg Festival and to defend as well that the religion, culture, and politics here is far less radical, because these secessionists, these so-called avant-gardists, many of them were hugely successful at their own audience. And I think in this one has to take a look at the controversy over Adolf Loos's building right across from the Hofburg. Yes, that's an interesting controversy.
Excuse me, just a few words in respect to Luega. It must be said totally clearly that Luega was not only an anti-Semite by chance or by idea, but he was basically an anti-Semite. He was basically an anti-Semite throughout his life, throughout his political career, and what's the most important thing is of all, he used this kind of anti-Semitism in a very consequent way. So he was, as everybody knows, the famous role model for a man named Adolf Hitler. And this should not be kind of...
But he was not exceptional. The majority of Viennese artists.
We had many mavericks. Yes, we had many mavericks in this scenery. For instance, Lanz von Liebenfels. But this Lanz von Liebenfels was just an outsider maverick, but Luega was in the center of power. And this is a very big difference. And he ruled this country for 13 years. And within those 13 years, this idea of truly Viennese and old Vienna was proposed in a very professional, very modern way. He, as everybody knows, he also had his comrades for the really dirty work in the second line. But he was dirty enough in his own politics. So I think it's absolutely important to see this scenery of modernity in Vienna as a kind of some islands within a sea of populistic hatred and prejudice. And if we want to speak about Vienna now, around 1900, we can't avoid to take a step into this sea, even it smells dirty.
Well, no, I think you're totally right. I just wanted to point out that I don't think his anti-Semitism was exceptional. And I agree with you that the Mahler parody has to do with the hypocrisy of this myth of old Vienna. Because as you know, even the beautiful Danube, which was written for the Gesamtverein, for example, in the 60s, was already the mythologizing of this old Vienna. And the Jewish population that came to Vienna after 1867 bought into it themselves, the young Erich Wolfgang Korngold, because it was a common fictional ground that they could also express.
Yes, and it was also a way for a career.
That's right.
Because, for instance, the waltz is a typical form of vernacular music. If we take a look back in the beginning of the 19th century, waltz in Vienna was not this kind of identity music, which is today. The waltz was a thing for the lower classes. In the best case, visited by some persons from the upper classes, but anonymously.
Yeah.
And after the 1860s, beginning with the 1860s and 70s, the waltz was changed into a kind of identification music and symbol for Vienna. For instance, also in the operettas, which were written also in the first generation of Viennese operetta culture, there is steadily aspect, for instance, for chains of dances. In each place in the operetta where there's the possibility to place a dance, there are chains of dances placed. For instance, dances which have to do with the couleur locale of the operetta, libretto, and all those chains of dances, even in the 1860s and the 1870s, are ending in a waltz. So the waltz is a kind of crowning apotheosis in style of imagined identity. This is a kind of Verwienerung. Everything is seen out from the position of Vienna, but this is not a kind of ideology in the sense which was officially proclaimed in those years. The officially proclaimed ideology was the Gesamtstaat, which means Austria is more than the details, more than its nationalities. Austria is more, Schwarz-Gelb. This was officially proclaimed by the Emperor House and so on, but it was never politically realized. And it also was never politically realized artistically, for instance, in Viennese operetta. There's a theory which says Viennese operetta, is the artistic form of this Gesamtstaatsidee. This does not hold the test.
Yeah. I wanted to.
If I may one thing, one of the things to realize, I think, is in the time that Freud writes his dream, and what you're speaking about, the access to real performances of opera was very limited. So the tunes, the simplified tunes and dances, were made popular by domestic music making, sheet music that was sold, not by going or seeing in a video. This is access to the Staatsoper or Volksoper later is very limited. So the popularity has to do with the simplicity and the easy accessibility of the tune.
Yes. So I want to go back to the idea of Freud not knowing anything about opera or music. And Freud would have agreed with you. You know, this is a position that he often wrote about. But what I'm interested in is basically going against the grain. And part of what I'm doing and what I'm writing right now is basically looking for, especially in the Book of Dreams, many operas come up.
Right.
And it's a strange repertoire. It's not what one would imagine. You know, especially thinking of Freud was living in this post-Wagnerian society. You know, Schoenberg was already at work. And his the examples that he comes up with, Mozart, you know, I would say is a crowning example. You know, he had a passion for Mozart. And this is very interesting because, you know, even though Freud was an avant-garde thinker, when it came to the psyche, when it came to psychology, when it came to philosophy. His theories were radical. Musically, he was extremely conservative.
That's very common.
Yeah.
I remember, I don't mean to be name dropping, but I had a conversation with Georgia O'Keeffe, the American painter.
Yeah.
She was in her 90s. And I asked her, what kind of music do you listen to? And she said, Mozart and Bach.
Yeah.
And I said, have you ever listened to the music of Aaron Copland, who at that time was 80, right? And she said, oh, what a nice young man. my point is that the other music, the radical artists have been very conservative about their musical taste. And so I think there's another writer, if you're looking for an example of someone who hid his real affinity for music, there's one very good case, and that's Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov always said, I'm not musical. He had a son who was an opera singer, but I'm not musical, I'm not musical. It turns out he was hiding something. So maybe you'll find something that was it.
Well, the other counterexample, which is very interesting from the same era, would be Proust. Freud was, his musical taste was Mozart and others. He talks about, it's very interesting. The other figure that comes up, for opera in Freud is Carl Maria von Weber, Der Freischütz, which is such a strange, opera to be gravitating to in the
most important opera of the 19th century.
Yeah, but
the most important opera, most revolutionary opera.
Yeah, but Proust, in contrast, was listening to Wagner and defending Wagner in face of all the anti-Wagnerians, including
with many other French. He also was listening by telephone
to
Pilgrim.
Yeah.
You're opening up so many difficult and dangerous discussions, of course, with the Salzburg festivals and Helga's. But I was wondering, as we have a panel on literature and psychoanalysis in the afternoon, if Freud wasn't maybe somehow a better writer than many authors at his time in composing his dream settings. And I think also Proust used the music debates of his time for his shaping of his personality. I just want to pinpoint two aspects maybe for our later panels, the question of acceleration in society and also in the 1920s of taking the acceleration out of society. I think that's where the Salzburg Festival comes in. And of course, tradition you mentioned Zemlinsky, you mentioned Markert. There's a huge Handwerk quality in music and what happens, what breaks this up, as you mentioned, in the notion that you have to capture the changes of society. But as we have 10 minutes left 50 minutes even left for discussion, I want to give the audience the chance to end into the discussion, and you can continue and you can put as much TNT into it as you like. Yeah. Please.
Thank you so much for this inspiring discussion. I just wanted to ask you, what about Wittgenstein's influence on the analysis of language? Also, which reflects maybe also in laws, in the architecture of the time, also for Schoenberg, Bergweber, and all this line of avant-garde. I think this name was a little bit missing for me, and how would you place him in that context?
If I can start, so Wittgenstein is a good example of his musical tastes are unbelievably conservative. He's a little doubtful about Brahms. He has a kind of Wagnerian contempt for Mendelssohn. He has no interest in Schoenberg or anything that's modern. He's completely conservative in musical taste. He's contemptuous of his brother, who commissioned all of this music. Terrifically smart about music. And Brahms is, remember, he was taught by Labor, Joseph Labor, who was the blind organist, composer who was patronized by the Wittgenstein family. And Labor was a wonderful composer and very conservative. So he falls into that category. But he certainly is a person who had harbored ideas about music as being, in some way ethically has superior qualities to language. Music was always, in the investigations, a kind of template of a different system, but related to the use of language. So he's always interested in that question, in a way that Freud is not, but he is definitely interested. Of course, he has not negative views about Freud.
Thank you.
At the beginning, you mentioned, why Vienna and other cities of Europe, and I guess my follow-up would be, how does what's happening in Vienna compare to what's happening in Paris? Because Paris is still the head of the art world, but in music, how do you compare the two?
Maybe Rubén, that's
Well, Paris in the 1890s was, of course, I think it was much larger, and it was more of the crossroads. I think all these people came to Paris. And I think there was a sense in which one had to make it in Paris, at least at a certain point to make it musical. There's a famous example of Wagner, trying to go to Paris.
And Mahler tried to bring the Vienna Philharmonic with the patronage of Pauline Metternich to Paris. It was a disaster.
Yeah. I mean, I think what was interesting about Paris at this time was that the world of culture had a frivolous side, that had to do with all the society and the salons and the desire to be seen. And that was always in tension with and that was Wagner's experience. I think Wagner came to try to do something serious, and he clashed, with this aspect of the Parisian world. I have the sense that mondanité was, of course, also present in Vienna, but I think it was less powerful. It had less of a, I think there were other influences, that would counteract. But this was, and Proust was very interested in it.
I would defend Paris against Wagner. And Berlioz did all his best not to go to Tannhäuser. He didn't want to go there, and he hated the music. So Paris is not, I wouldn't take the Baudelaire-Wagner example as emblematic of Parisian. I would defend the Parisian.
But indeed, is around 1900, in Paris modernity, there's a very strong aspect of Wagnerism. Yes. It's also the French word, the Wagnerisme. And this is, but it's not a Wagner only as a composer, but Wagner also as a symbol, which is discussed in Paris in those years. But I think there are, like in Vienna, many things, many aspects and many techniques and methods which are normal for our understanding of modernity today, also in Paris then were marginalized. For instance, the reception of symbolism in composing was in very different ways realized, but it took very long time till it reached broader spectrum of public. But Paris is interesting in respect to Vienna in another way. For instance, when in Budapest around 1900, a few years after 1900, modernity groups arose. They were orientated not to Vienna, they were orientated to Paris. For instance, there was young Bartók and Andreadi and those people. They formed a new periodical which was called New Guard. And New Guard means the West. And the West was not Vienna, the West was Paris.
Yeah, and actually something that's quite different between Paris and Vienna at this time was that the idea of modernity was, to use a term that we would use today, it was racialized. And these discussions of Wagner, what they set up in a lot of cases were basically an opposition between French music, which was Latin, which had all these qualities that were associated with the Latin spirit, and Germanic music. And actually a very interesting figure was Reinaldo Hahn, who was actually from Venezuela, and he was a very vocal anti-Wagnerian. He studied with Massenet, and he defended this tradition of French music that was Latin. And he had a great line. He wrote this letter to Proust. He said, "The Germans can make music like an elephant can walk on a tightrope." This was No, this was the.
Then the other thing that distinguishes is the idea of empire. So the Austrians had empire inside,
Yes.
where the Hungarians resisted,
Yeah.
so they went to Paris. But the French had a huge colonial empire, and the importance in French modernism of so-called Asiatic, Oriental, Japanese, and these
Spanish
influences are much more pronounced than in Vienna.
Helga, you have been challenged, or no? There's, okay. Sorry.
Excuse me. Thank you very much for giving me the microphone. With reference to the whole question of modernity, I just wanted to ask whether there was some attempt on the part of, I guess in this case, Austrians or Viennese, to link to what was happening in the rest of the world, also including, for example, the United States. If you think about it, Tchaikovsky performed at Carnegie and Dvorak composed here. So, I mean, nowadays we can't think of modernity without excluding the United States. So we have already spoken of France, and I'm sure there are a lot more other places in the world which could be included under this rubric, considering that even African art was already in Picasso's work. So why shouldn't the rhythms, jazz and drums and all that also be part of the consideration of all these highbrow musicians that you have stated?
Maybe we take two questions and then try to answer it. Thank you.
Yeah, we like to simplify the world, one movement after the others. As you all expressed, they were all at the same times, these movements. And Karl Kraus and Schönberg were born in the same year, in 1874. There is a very good exhibition in Vienna. And Schönberg is inviting Kraus, I do not know how often, to come to a concert. He does not go there. He is much too conservative. He only liked operetta. And it was really very interesting. Some weeks ago in the Musikverein, they had a concert with 5 composers who composed in 1920. Their reaction on World War I, it was completely different. It was Maurice Ravel, it was Schönberg, it was Hindemith, excuse me, I forgot the others now. I think what I liked so much of these times, that there were so many movements at the same time. And as you said, the charm of this time was this, they were so convinced that their idea is the only idea, and they have to fulfill it. And the Salzburg Festival was a fruit of this idea. They were not an avant-garde music festival, not at all. They wanted to re-establish the old values. They wanted, like all artists, to be performed. Strauss wanted to hear his own music. And so I think that we should keep these many movements who have to defend their standpoint. And once the famous composer Nikolaus Anokur made a wonderful opening speech at the festival in 1995. So 75 years of the festival. And I was so touched because he described this looking for the truth of an artist. As you said, they're all in truth business. And he said the truth is in every time different. And we find things ridiculous, what in former times was the standard of bringing the Ninth Symphony. So I think that we could take an example of.
A short time for a concluding remark.
Just a small answer, very small answer to this Kraus Schönberg, but there's a very important fact. In the whole VICCA, there's just one example of printed music, and this is by Schoenberg. Because
I thought it is really Botstein.
no. Krauss, as was told yesterday already, and I think it will be a part of the upcoming panels, but for Krauss, Schoenberg was a kind of very key figure for ethics in the arts. That did not mean that he had to like his music. And his respect to operetta was the operetta of Offenbach, not the operetta of Leha. And a small answer for your question in respect to reception of jazz. This begins rather early in a field which we have not even visited today, in the field of popular music in Vienna, in those regions where the people from the first district also came, but also the other population from Vienna could be seen, for instance, in the Vienna Prater. There were playing bands, and different bands, even military bands, even Austrian military bands played ragtimes already in the 1890s. But a fruitful compositorial reception of jazz, this was very complex in Vienna, especially because even in the 1920s, for instance, also Schoenberg had a great prejudice against jazz. For Schoenberg, jazz was a kind of symbol for decadence, and it took very, very long till Austrian composers got a fresh look on this, what jazz really means. This would be a special conference next year.
Yeah, and also we tend to think, going back to Helga's point, that all of these artists and writers and musicians were somehow aligned. Let's say that someone who was interested, that Klimt, would have been reading avant-garde literature and listening to avant-garde music, but it's actually there are a lot of tensions. Freud is the perfect example. So Freud was revolutionary in his thinking about the psyche, but he was listening to Mozart. His literary examples are always Goethe and Shakespeare. Yeah. When you look at his architectural tastes, he lived in this 19th century cave, would be a way to describe, his apartment in Bergasse. So there's a sense in which one could be revolutionary in one aspect and very conservative in all the other arts. And I think this is probably more the case. In Krauss would be one example.
Last question for the director and musicologist.
I know I'm standing in between you and coffee, but just allow me one quick comment. There's a fantastic exhibition in the Metropolitan Museum that most of you might have seen already. I'm now advertising for the work of the Metropolitan Museum Harlem Renaissance. And it needed 100 years for the United States to really deeply analyze what African American artists achieved after the 1920s. And where did most of them go? To Paris, not to Vienna. Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, painters, and they absolutely felt more comfortable in Paris than obviously in Vienna. Colonial past and all of that, but Paris was really a spearhead for that movement, also because racial discrimination was not so obvious. So really a recommendation, go see Harlem Renaissance, it is really moving.
Thank you very much. I have to look at the time, and you brilliantly said going against the grain is the motto of this and all the other discussions. So let's go against the grain in the coffee break. Thank you very much for being here.